Thank you, choir. That was wonderful. And thank you all for being here. Well, it's another full house. We seem to really be picking up our attendance here lately. And that's with a number of our sisters, our women, who are on retreat this weekend. And so we are praying that they are having as good a time as we are. This is Women's History Month. And I'm going to ask the AV team to do me a favor and put the slides on my screen here. Yeah. Thank you. This is Women's History Month, and it comes at a time in our country's history when there is a conscious effort, it seems, to erase the unique contributions of the constituents of our society. Women, blacks, Latinos, Asians, Hispanic, all of those woke communities are being erased. Women are being removed from their positions of authority, which they have earned through hard work. And here is an opportunity for us to push back, because it's still Women's History Month at Pilgrim Church. When I went to seminary, and you've heard me talk about this before, I went to Union Theological Seminary in New York to study Black liberation theology. I was ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I was pastoring within the Black church and the Black community. And that was the preparation that I felt was necessary to serve that church. But when I got to Union Theological Seminary, I found that there were a variety of liberation movements. I first heard, oh, wait a minute, there was a Latin American liberation theology, the original one. Didn't know that. And so I learned about that, and I learned there were gay liberation theologians. Not a lot had been published at that point in time, except for the Latin American theologians. They had been the most prolific writers at the time, basically in South America. And also women's liberation theologians. And so going to Union Theological Seminary was one of those inadvertent decisions that changed my life. And I'm so glad for it. And so by being exposed to all of the liberation movements, it prepared me to serve all of the church and not just one community. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what is women's liberation theology, feminist liberation theology. Well, of course, we have the feminist movement at large, but Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who wrote the basic book of feminist theology, a feminist, in memory of her, a feminist theological reconstruction of Christian origins. And she wants to take a different approach than the traditional, kind of like Dana did with our Women's History Month, not so much talking about individual women that had excelled, and the tradition had been before to find a woman in the Bible and to lift her up as, aha, there was a woman in the Bible. And, but to do a more holistic approach, to talk about women as a group, women as a body, women as a whole, and their presence and their role in the history of Christianity. To understand they were always there. And sometimes we fall into the trap of trying to pick out one from the history that has been presented to us. And so Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza says, no, 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 let's raise the level of this conversation. Let's raise the level of this debate. And to understand that women have always been there, but have been erased by those who wrote the book. In her book, she cites several theologians, but she begins by saying, "It is precisely the power of oppression that deprives people of their history. This is perceived by both Black and Latin American theologians. Alex Haley traces the history of his people in hope that this story of our people can alleviate the legacies of the fact that predominantly the histories are written by the winners." This passage in Mark today is a perfect example. Now, Jesus concludes the evening by hushing all of the critics who had condemned this woman for what she was trying to do, or in fact, for what she did. This woman walks in with this very expensive ointment and anoints Jesus' head. And they all complain about her coming in and doing this act, and they could have sold this ointment for a lot of money and given it to the poor. But Jesus shushes all of them and says, "She has done a good work for me. And what she has done will be told wherever the gospel is preached in memory of her." What's her name? This is a feminist approach, to look at the story from the perspective of the woman, whether there's a woman in the story or not. To look at it from her eyes, through her ears, and to hear her voice even when she does not speak. Fiorenza acknowledges that we know whose house it was held in, Simon the leper. That tells you a lot right there, because in that culture, you did not have dinner at the leper's house. But this is part of that extravagant welcome of Jesus, that he was with everybody. So we know it's at Simon's house. We know the name of some of the disciples, like Peter, who betrayed Jesus, who denied Jesus. We even know the name of Judas, who in fact betrayed and sold Jesus out. So we know all these male characters and all their dastardly deeds, but we don't know the name of the woman that Jesus said should be preached and proclaimed wherever the good news is shared. That's a classical example of what she means by how the winners, the men in the story, have written the women out of the story. The other Gospels tell a version of this story. And so our tendency is to kind of mush them all together. Well, in John, she's a woman with a bad reputation, maybe a prostitute. And she comes and washes his feet with her tears and dries them with her hair in this very erotic scene in John. I mean, you should read it, but not in front of your children. And they say, oh, so that they mush this woman into one personality. But Fiorenza says, no, let her stand on her own. And when we let her stand on her own, I think we can hear some different things. Number one, she speaks with her actions, not with her words. And so I'm going to try to fill in her words, if I might, in what you call the preacher's license to embellish the story. I can imagine her response to hearing those men complain, "This ointment is very expensive. It probably cost 200 denarii. It could have been, or 300 denarii. It could have been sold and given to the poor." And she could retort, 300? I paid 500 denarii. You don't shop where I shop. This was likely a woman of means. She said, yeah, I paid 500 denarii for it after I had given 1,000 denarii to the poor. See, this is that psychology of scarcity that we fall into that stymies our generosity. They're looking at this ointment as if that's all the money that was available. She says, you don't know me. You don't know what I can do. So I have done this because I know it didn't take a soothsayer to figure out that Jesus wasn't long for the world. And they all knew that this time of Passover, this intense time of excitement about celebrating the Passover, and the Passover, remember, was a festival of liberation. Liberation theology takes its name from the idea of Passover when God said to Moses in the sight of that burning bush, I have come down to set my people free. I have heard their misery at the hand of their taskmasters, and I have come down to set them free. And so that is the mission of liberation. She knew that Jesus and what he was doing was not going to sit well with the Romans. And so in the peak of the festival, the Romans always ordered extra soldiers into Jerusalem because they knew that somebody might take this ritual seriously and try to get some freedom. And there were rebellions, and there were riots, and there were times when the Roman soldiers had to put those rebellions down with fierce violence. And crucifixion was the standard punishment for those who would resist the Roman Empire. So this woman would know that Jesus and the way he was acting and what he was teaching and what he was preaching, he wasn't long for this world. So she brought this ointment and anointed him in advance. Because the real indignity of crucifixion was the denial of a burial for that victim. They were hung up on the cross and left to rot and denied a proper burial. That's what the soldiers were there for, guarding these dying bodies to prevent their friends and families from coming to take them down and to bury them. And so she anointed him in advance because she knew she wouldn't have the opportunity later on. She continues. I want to go back a slide. Oops. Okay. Gustavo Gutierrez, one of the founders of Latin American liberation theology, writes, human history has been written by a white hand, a male hand, from the dominating social class. The perspective of the defeated in history is different. Attempts have been made to wipe from their minds the memories of their struggles. This is to deprive them of a source of energy, of an historical will to rebellion. That's what canceling all of these unique celebrations of constituencies of resistance are about. To prevent rebellion, to prevent activism toward liberation. What we have to understand is these Gospels, as much as we revere them, were actually pretty reactionary documents. They were all written after the Jewish revolt against Rome. Yes, ultimately, the Jewish folk in Jerusalem did rebel against Rome, and Rome cracked down with a siege of the city and destroyed Jerusalem. And all these Christians who were with Jesus, all these Jesus followers, saw what happened. So after the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem and scattered these folks into the diaspora, they sat down to write the Gospels. But they wrote Gospels in a way that would not offend the Romans. And you can tell how the further you get from Jesus' life, the more conservative the writings of the early Christians gets. That's where you get wives obey your husbands. not in the Gospels, but in the letters of Paul. That's where you get a woman should not teach, because they are trying to comply with the culture around them, not to provoke the Romans, who they know are quite capable of putting down this movement violently. And so Elizabeth Schuster-Friedrich and other theologians say, we cannot confine ourselves to the male imagination. We have to understand that the women were there, and we have to listen for their voices. We have to listen for their lives, and we have to see how we can carry on in that same spirit. And so the church has come a long way, and we ought to be proud to belong to the United Church of Christ. I was born. Which ordained the first woman in the United States and continues to have women's leadership in every aspect of the church. And if you hadn't read your newsletter lately, right now the United Church of Christ has as its general minister and president a woman. And so our own conference, the Southern California, Nevada Conference of the United Church of Christ, has as its conference minister a woman. And this is not DEI, this is the church. This is the church. And so as we go forward in this Women's History Month, we'll be learning more about women's liberation theology and how we can hear and listen for the voices of women, even their echoes that come through the text that has been preserved throughout the ages. Let the people of God say, amen.